Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 1943. 24-year-old maternity nurse Vivian Halstead wakes in the middle of the night to her own scream. She's dreaming of an infant with blue lips, and above him leans an old ward attendant holding a small brown bottle. This is the 7th such dream in a month, and every time, the same face. Vivian sat upright in her narrow bed, hands pressed to her temples. The sheets clung damply to her skin, soaked through with cold sweat that made her shiver in the March chill. Her heart hammered against her ribs as if trying to escape her chest entirely. Through the window of her room at the nurse's residence on Forbes Avenue, the March darkness stretched toward dawn. 3 hours until her shift began at Allegheny Maternity Hospital. 3 hours to try to calm her racing thoughts and convince herself she wasn't losing her mind. The dream had been so vivid this time, more real than memory. She could still see the infant's tiny chest struggling for breath, each inhalation a visible effort that made the fragile ribcage contract inward. Could still hear the soft whisper of prayer from Miss Constance Meriweather's lips, words that sounded like benediction but felt like condemnation. Could still smell the sickly sweet medicinal odor of laudanum mixed with the antiseptic scent of the hospital nursery. She tried to settle back into sleep, pulling the thin wool blanket up to her chin, closing her eyes against the dim light filtering through the window from the street lamp below. But the image persisted behind her closed eyelids, burned there like a photograph negative. The gnarled, work-worn hands of Constance Meriweather, the senior ward attendant at Allegheny Maternity Hospital, cradling a newborn boy with an almost maternal tenderness. Those same hands that had worked in the hospital for 2 decades, that everyone praised as, quote, zero, that supposedly had a magic touch with even the most difficult infants. The hands that had touched thousands upon thousands of newborns in their first moments of life. And the same baby boy who had died 2 days ago, little Thomas Kowalski, born 3 weeks premature to Anna Kowalski, wife of a Polish steelworker from Lawrenceville. Vivian had been there for the delivery. She'd seen the baby emerge small but breathing, had watched him pink up and cry weakly but persistently. 5 pounds even. Premature, yes. Small, certainly. But viable. Fighting. Until Mrs. Meriweather had taken him for routine cord care. He was weak, Mrs. Meriweather had said 6 hours later when they found the baby dead in his warming crib, her voice soft and certain, one hand touching the small silver cross that always hung at her throat. The Lord called him home before he could suffer more. It's a mercy, really, when you think about it. These weak ones, they're not meant for this world. Better a quick, peaceful passing than days of struggle and pain. Vivian had heard those exact words before. Too many times. Always the same phrasing, the same gentle certainty. Weak ones. Not meant for this world. The Lord's mercy. Better this way. And always, always, the babies died within hours of Mrs. Meriweather uttering those words, as if her pronouncement itself was a death sentence. But that was insane, wasn't it? Nurses didn't kill babies, especially not nurses like Constance Meriweather, who was universally beloved, who had dedicated her entire adult life to the care of newborns, who was called the heart and soul of the maternity ward by Dr. Raymond Pritchard himself. Except for the numbers. Vivian switched on the bedside lamp, squinting against the sudden brightness. The small room came into focus. Institutional furniture provided by the hospital, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a dresser with a cloudy mirror, a straight-backed chair, a small closet. On the wall above the bed hung a wooden crucifix. Vivian wasn't particularly religious. Her mother had been, devoutly so, but Vivian's faith had never quite taken root. But the crucifix had come with the room, and she'd never bothered to remove it. Now it seemed to stare down at her accusingly. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Was she bearing false witness? Or was she the only one willing to see the truth? On the dresser sat a framed photograph of her parents on their wedding day, 1918, just before her father shipped out to France. He'd died at Belleau Wood before Vivian was born. Her mother, Evelyn Halstead, had worked as a laundress for 24 years to put food on the table and save enough to send Vivian to nursing school. She died of pneumonia in 1940, the year Vivian graduated, worn out from decades of hard labor and poverty. But before she died, lying in a charity ward bed, she'd gripped Vivian's hand with surprising strength and whispered, quote, _8__. Vivian had promised, and she'd meant it. The smallest, most helpless, most voiceless people of all were newborn babies. Especially the premature ones, the fragile ones, the ones struggling to survive their first hours and days of life. They couldn't speak, couldn't cry out for justice, couldn't tell anyone if someone was hurting them. They needed someone to be their voice. Vivian opened the drawer of her nightstand and pulled out the composition notebook. The cover was worn soft from handling, the corners bent. Inside, page after page was covered with her careful handwriting, dates, names, weights, circumstances. She'd been keeping it for 4 months now, since last November when she'd first felt that cold finger of suspicion trace down her spine during a particularly tragic shift. She'd been assisting with a delivery. A healthy, full-term baby girl, 7 pounds, 3 ounces, good APGAR scores. But during the routine newborn examination, Dr. Leonard Ashford had detected a heart murmur. Not necessarily dangerous. Many infant heart murmurs resolved on their own, but something to watch. The baby had been placed in the nursery for observation. Mrs. Meriweather had taken one look at her and said quietly to no one in particular, "Poor little thing. Something wrong with the heart. She won't last long. Better if it's quick." The baby had died that night. Sudden, unexplained cardiac arrest, the death certificate read. But Vivian, doing the late-night check, had noticed the faint, sweet smell on the infant's lips. A smell she recognized from her pharmacology training. Laudanum. She'd mentioned it to Dr. Ashford the next day, hesitantly, uncertain. He'd been dismissive. __quote _10___. But Vivian couldn't let it go. She'd started reviewing the maternity ward's mortality records, going back years. And that's when she discovered the pattern. She opened the notebook now to the first page. At the top, in large letters, she'd written, "Infant Mortality Analysis, Allegheny Maternity Hospital, 1928 to 1943. Below that, arranged in neat columns, date of death, baby's name, or baby boy/girl, mother's surname, if unnamed. Weight at birth, gestational age, cause of death as listed on certificate, nurse/attendant present at death. 34 entries, spanning 15 years, and in the final column of every single entry, C. Meriweather. Vivian had done the mathematics over and over, checking and rechecking her figures until her eyes burned and her head ached. She'd even gone to Carnegie Institute of Technology and posed a quote 12 to Professor Martin Chen in the mathematics department, presenting the data without names or identifying details. Just pure numbers. Professor Chen had worked through the calculations, his elderly face growing increasingly puzzled, and finally looked up at her over his spectacles. Vivian had asked, her mouth dry. He'd paused, choosing his words carefully. Human intervention, intentional or otherwise. Vivian traced her finger down the entries now, reading the names. Each one represented a life cut short. Each one had a family who'd grieved. Each one might have grown up, gone to school, fallen in love, had children of their own. January 14th, 1928. Baby girl Morrison. 35 weeks gestation. Weight 4 pounds 2 ounces. Cause, respiratory failure. C. Meriweather present. March 3rd, 1928. Baby boy Chen. 36 weeks gestation. Weight 4 pounds 8 ounces. Cause, cardiac arrest. C. Meriweather present. November 12th, 1928. Baby girl Kowalski. 38 weeks gestation. Weight 5 pounds 6 ounces. Cause, failure to thrive. C. Meriweather present. 3 in the first year of data. Then the pattern continued year after year. Some years only 1 or 2. Other years as many as 7. But always, always present in the final column. C. Meriweather. The truly chilling part was the selection criteria. If Vivian's terrible suspicion was correct, Mrs. Meriweather never targeted the obviously healthy babies. Never the robust 8-pound infants who emerged pink and screaming. Always the borderline cases. The slightly premature ones, the low-weight ones, the ones with minor complications like heart murmurs or jaundice or mild respiratory distress. The ones who might plausibly die on their own, whose deaths wouldn't immediately raise red flags in the medical review process. The ones whose loss could be explained away as, quote, 17, or, quote, 18, or, quote, 19. But infant mortality statistics told a different story. According to the most recent data from the Allegheny County Health Department, average infant mortality in the county ran about 35 to 40 deaths per 1,000 live births annually. At Allegheny Maternity Hospital, one of Pittsburgh's largest and best-equipped facilities, the rate should be lower than average, maybe 25 to 30 per 1,000. With roughly 800 births per year at the hospital, that meant approximately 20 to 24 infant deaths annually would be statistically normal. But Vivian had calculated the numbers specifically for shifts when Constance Meriweather was on duty versus shifts when she wasn't. The difference was stark. During Meriweather's shifts, infant mortality ran nearly 50 per 1,000 births. During other attendants' shifts, it ran 22 per 1,000. More than double. Over 15 years, that translated to roughly 34 deaths. 34 babies who statistically shouldn't have died. 34 names in Vivian's notebook. But none of it made sense from a motive standpoint, which was what had kept Vivian silent for so long, doubting her own conclusions. Constance Meriweather received no financial benefit from the deaths. Vivian had quietly, carefully checked. The hospital didn't pay bonuses based on patient outcomes. Mrs. Meriweather's salary was standard for senior ward attendants, and she lived modestly in a boarding house on Highland Avenue, sending most of her money to support a disabled sister in Ohio. She held no grudges against specific families. The victims came from all backgrounds, all neighborhoods, all ethnic groups. Polish steelworkers' babies, Italian grocers' babies, Irish cops' babies, Jewish tailors' babies, Negro janitors' babies. The ward attendant showed no discrimination, no pattern of targeting based on race or class or religion. She had no connection to any of the deceased mothers. No old feuds, no romantic triangles, no inheritance disputes. Nothing. She'd worked at the hospital for 20 years, since its founding in 1923 when she was 38 years old, and by all accounts had been exemplary from day one. Dr. Raymond Pritchard, the hospital director, called her, quote, 21, quote, and, quote, 22, quote. The older nurses remembered how Mrs. Meriweather had kept premature babies alive in the early days before modern incubators existed, warming infants against her own body, feeding them with eyedroppers, working triple shifts without complaint when the hospital was short-staffed. Quote, 23, quote, they said. Quote, 24, quote. But saints didn't kill babies. And the numbers didn't lie. 34 excess deaths. 34 names. 34 families who'd buried children who might have lived. Vivian closed the notebook and tucked it carefully back into the drawer, pushing it all the way to the back behind her extra stockings and undergarments, where her roommate Martha wouldn't accidentally find it. Martha Schaefer was a good nurse and a fundamentally decent person, but she was also the worst gossip in the entire hospital. If Martha found the notebook, everyone from the janitor to Dr. Pritchard would know about Vivian's suspicions by the end of the lunch break. And if Vivian was wrong, if she was seeing patterns that didn't exist, if she was accusing an innocent woman based on statistical coincidence and her own paranoid imagination, then her career in nursing was finished. Done. She'd be labeled unstable, unreliable, dangerously paranoid. No hospital in Pittsburgh would hire her. Probably no hospital in Pennsylvania. She'd end up working in some factory for the war effort, assembling shell casings or parachutes, her nursing training wasted, her mother's sacrifice meaningless. But if she was right, if her terrible, nightmarish suspicion proved true, then every day of silence, every shift of inaction meant another premature or fragile newborn might be at risk. Vivian lay back down, staring at the ceiling, watching the play of shadows from the streetlight outside as the occasional car passed by. She'd made a decision. Weeks ago, really, though she'd been too frightened to fully acknowledge it. Today, she would watch Mrs. Meriweather more carefully than ever before. She would document everything. She would position herself to intervene if necessary. And if she saw anything at all, that confirmed her suspicions beyond doubt, she would act. Even if it destroyed her career. Even if no one believed her. Even if she ended up looking like a fool or a liar or a madwoman. Because some things were more important than professional reputation or career advancement or personal security. Like keeping babies alive. Like giving them their chance to grow up. Like being the voice for those who had no voice. Like keeping the promise she'd made to her dying mother. Help the people who can't help themselves. Morning came slowly, reluctantly, the sky outside gradually lightening from black to gray to the peculiar yellowish gray that meant industrial pollution mixing with dawn. Vivian dressed carefully in her white nurse's uniform, making sure every button was fastened, every seam straight, every wrinkle smoothed. She pinned her cap precisely in place, checked her appearance in the small mirror above the dresser. Dark circles under her eyes from too many sleepless nights, her brown hair pulled back severe and professional in the required style. She looked older than 24. She felt about 100. She grabbed her handbag and coat and headed downstairs. The nurses' residence was a 3-story brick building that housed 42 nurses and nursing students, all single women working at various Pittsburgh hospitals. It smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and floor wax. The walls were thin enough that Vivian could hear her neighbors' conversations and snoring. But it was clean, respectable, and affordable on a nurse's salary. $50 a month, including meals. The walk to Allegheny Maternity Hospital took 15 minutes through the cold March morning. Pittsburgh was gray and industrial as always, the sky thick with smoke from steel mills that ran 24 hours a day for the war effort. Men worked triple shifts forging armor plate, gun barrels, ship components. Women worked in the factories too now, filling jobs left vacant by husbands and brothers and sons shipped overseas to Europe and the Pacific. The whole city hummed with desperate, exhausted productivity. Every newspaper carried casualty lists. Every neighborhood had gold stars in windows. Everyone knew someone who'd died or been wounded or gone missing in action. The war had changed everything, including medicine. There were drug shortages. Morphine and sulfa powder went to the military first. There were equipment shortages. New incubators were almost impossible to get. There were personnel shortages. Young male doctors were being drafted, and even experienced nurses were leaving for better-paying factory jobs or joining the Army Nurse Corps for deployment overseas. Which meant the nurses and doctors who remained were working harder than ever, with fewer resources, under more pressure. Which meant mistakes happened. Which meant some deaths could be explained away as unfortunate but inevitable consequences of wartime scarcity. Which meant it was easier than ever for someone like Constance Meriweather, if Vivian's suspicions were correct, to hide what she was doing. Vivian arrived at the hospital at 5:40 a.m., 20 minutes before her shift officially began. She always came early. It gave her time to review overnight reports, check on patients, prepare mentally for the day. Allegheny Maternity Hospital occupied a 3-story brick building on Liberty Avenue, imposing and institutional. It had been built in 1923 with funding from the Carnegie Foundation, part of Andrew Carnegie's legacy of philanthropic public works. Tall windows with peeling white paint. Long corridors that smelled of bleach and boiled formula and something else underneath. The metallic scent of blood and the sweet-sour smell of birth and the particular odor of too many bodies in too small spaces. She entered through the staff entrance on the side of the building, nodded to the night security guard, Mr. Stanley Wojcik, a kindly Polish immigrant in his 60s who'd worked there since the building opened and who always had a smile and a "Good morning, Miss Vivian" ready, and made her way to the women's changing room in the basement. She stored her coat and handbag in her assigned locker, number 27, double-checked that her uniform was crisp and spotless, straightened her cap one more time, and headed up the stairs to the maternity ward on the second floor. The ward consisted of a large, open room with 12 beds for mothers in early labor or postpartum recovery, 2 private delivery rooms for active labor, a small operating room for emergency cesarean sections, a nursery with 8 warming cribs for newborns, and a staff room barely large enough for a desk, 3 chairs, and a filing cabinet. The floors were white linoleum, kept spotlessly clean by the night custodial staff. The walls were painted institutional green. The windows had bars on them, not because patients were imprisoned, but because the building was old and the bars had been there since construction for reasons no one quite remembered. Mrs. Constance Meriweather was already in the staff room when Vivian arrived. She was always early too, Vivian had noticed over the past months of observation. The ward attendant stood by the window, hands folded across her substantial midsection, gazing out at the gray Pittsburgh morning as if reading portents in the smoke. She was 58 years old, short and heavy, probably 200 pounds on a 5'3" frame. She had a soft, round, grandmotherly face with slightly protuberant eyes that were perpetually moist, giving her an expression of gentle sympathy even when her face was at rest. Her graying hair was pulled back in a tight, neat bun. She wore the standard white uniform dress of a senior ward attendant, spotlessly clean and carefully pressed despite the wartime shortage of laundry soap. Thick-soled shoes suitable for long hours on her feet, white stockings, and at her throat, always, the small silver cross on a delicate chain. __quote _26 __. Mrs. Meriweather smiled warmly as Vivian entered. Her voice was soft, slightly hoarse, the voice of someone who'd spent decades speaking gently to frightened mothers and fussy babies. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, Mrs. Meriweather," Vivian lied smoothly. "And you?" "Oh, you know how it is at my age. Up twice in the night to use the facilities, then awake at 4:30 no matter what time I went to bed. But the Lord gives us the strength we need for each day's work." She touched the cross at her throat, a habitual gesture Vivian had seen hundreds of times. "We have 2 mothers in active labor this morning, and both deliveries look complicated." Vivian pulled out her small notebook, the official one for patient notes, not the secret one hidden in her room. "Tell me." First is Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, 38 years old, first baby. She came in last night around 11 with contractions 5 minutes apart, but her blood pressure was quite elevated, 160/105. Dr. Ashford admitted her for monitoring and said if labor doesn't progress naturally by noon, he wants to induce with Pitocin. She's terrified, poor thing. This is her 4th pregnancy, but only the first to make it past the first trimester. She lost 3 babies to miscarriage, 1937, 1939, and 1941. Vivian made notes. First-time mother at 38 was risky in 1943. Medical science hadn't yet developed many of the interventions that would become standard decades later. High blood pressure during pregnancy was dangerous. It could indicate preeclampsia, which could lead to seizures, stroke, or death for both mother and baby. A history of 3 miscarriages suggested potential complications: incompetent cervix, hormonal imbalances, blood incompatibility issues. Vivian asked. There it was, that word. Quote 36. Quote, Mrs. Meriweather always used that specific word for the babies who later died. Not quote 37. Quote, though that was the medically correct term. Not quote 38 or quote 39 or quote 40. Just quote 41. With a particular inflection, gentle, almost pitying, as if she were already mourning them. Quote 42. Vivian said, keeping her voice carefully neutral, professional. Quote 43 Vivian went to the nurse's station. Really just a tall desk in the corner of the main ward, and pulled the patient files from the cabinet. She read through Dorothy Kellerman's chart meticulously. 38 years old, secretary at the Allegheny County Office Building, married to Harold Kellerman, accountant at Jones and Laughlin Steel. 3 previous pregnancies ending in first trimester miscarriage, 1937 at 8 weeks, 1939 at 10 weeks, 1941 at 9 weeks. Chronic mild hypertension treated with bed rest and reduced sodium diet. Currently 39 weeks pregnant by last menstrual period dating. The admission notes from Dr. Ashford expressed concern but cautious optimism. __quote _44__. Then Louise Bannister's chart. 22 years old, weaver at Hazelwood Textile Mill, married to Frank Bannister, steel worker at U.S. Steel Homestead Works. 3 previous successful pregnancies resulting in healthy children. Daughter age 5, son age 3, daughter age 18 months, all living. Current pregnancy estimated at 36 weeks gestation, with spontaneous labor onset at approximately midnight. Fundal height measurement suggested small for gestational age infant. Estimated fetal weight 5 pounds or less. Dr. Ashford's notes. __quote _45_ Vivian. Memorized every detail. She had a good memory for medical information, which had served her well in nursing school, and then began her rounds. She checked on each patient in the ward, taking vital signs, asking about pain levels and contractions, offering comfort and reassurance. The work was familiar, almost meditative. This was why she'd become a nurse in the first place, to help women through one of the most dangerous and miraculous experiences of their lives. Before modern medicine, childbirth had been one of the leading causes of death for women of childbearing age. Hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor, eclampsia, all could be fatal. Even now, in 1943, with hospitals and trained medical staff and proper sanitation, women still died in labor. Babies still died. But fewer than before. Much fewer. Medical science was advancing year by year. Techniques improved. Survival rates climbed. Penicillin was starting to become available for civilian use, preventing the infections that had killed so many new mothers. Blood typing and transfusion techniques saved women who would have bled to death a generation earlier. Unless someone was deliberately killing the most vulnerable infants. Unless someone was playing God, deciding which babies were worth saving and which were better off dead. Vivian pushed the thought away and focused on her patients. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman was in the second bed on the left side of the ward, sitting propped up with pillows, one hand on her swollen belly, the other clutching a rosary. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, thin everywhere except for the pregnancy. Her face was pale and drawn with anxiety. When Vivian approached, she looked up with desperate, frightened eyes. "Nurse, is everything all right? Is my baby all right?" "Everything's fine, Mrs. Kellerman," Vivian said gently, taking the woman's wrist to check her pulse. Elevated, 100 beats per minute, probably from anxiety. Dorothy Kellerman admitted. Her voice shook. Vivian interrupted firmly. It wasn't entirely true. Maternal age was definitely a risk factor, but sometimes reassurance was more important than statistical accuracy. "You're in the best possible place. Dr. Ashford is one of the finest obstetricians in Pittsburgh, and your baby has a strong, steady heartbeat. That's the most important sign." "But I lost 3 already. 3 times I thought I was finally going to be a mother, and 3 times... Her voice broke. Vivian sat on the edge of the bed and took Dorothy's hand. Vivian couldn't promise that. No nurse could. Birth was always dangerous, always unpredictable. But she could offer hope. "I think you're going to meet your baby very soon, and I think you're going to be a wonderful mother." Dorothy Kellerman's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded and squeezed Vivian's hand. Vivian continued her rounds, checking on the other patients, and finally came to Louise Bannister in the bed nearest the windows. Louise was young and looked even younger, round-faced, freckled, with red hair pulled back in a practical braid. She was sitting up calmly, knitting something small and blue. A baby hat, Vivian realized. When Vivian approached, Louise looked up and smiled. "Morning, nurse. I'm having contractions about every 8 minutes now. Not too bad yet, but getting stronger. How are you feeling otherwise?" "Fine, mostly. Just wish the baby would hurry up. I've got 3 other kids at home and my mother-in-law is watching them, but she's got her own work to do and I hate to burden her too long." Vivian checked Louise's vitals. Blood pressure normal, pulse normal, temperature normal. Palpated the abdomen gently. The baby was definitely small, positioned head down, moving normally. Quote, 63. Quote, 64. Louise's hands kept moving, needles clicking as she knitted. "Though I'll admit this one feels different. Smaller, quieter if that makes sense." It made perfect sense to Vivian. Mothers often knew when something was different about a pregnancy, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what. Quote 66 Vivian promised. She finished her rounds and returned to the staff room to document her findings. Mrs. Meriweather was still there, now sitting in one of the chairs, reading a well-worn Bible. She often did that during quiet moments on the ward. She looked up when Vivian entered. Mrs. Meriweather trailed off, shaking her head. There was something in her tone that made Vivian's skin prickle, a kind of resignation, as if the outcome were already determined, as if the baby were already dead and they were just going through the motions. Dorothy Kellerman's labor began in earnest at 9:47 a.m. when her water broke with a sudden gush that soaked through the sheets. Within minutes, contractions intensified from uncomfortable to agonizing. Vivian and Mrs. Opal Fredericks, the senior nurse on duty, helped her to one of the delivery rooms while Mrs. Meriweather changed the bed linens and prepared the nursery. Dr. Leonard Ashford arrived at 10:15, summoned by telephone from his office downtown. He was a tall, thin man of about 50, with a receding hairline and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him an owlish appearance. He'd been practicing obstetrics for 25 years and had delivered thousands of babies. He examined Mrs. Kellerman quickly and efficiently. 5 centimeters dilated, he announced. "Labor is progressing well. Mrs. Kellerman, I know you're in pain, but you're doing wonderfully. Just keep breathing through the contractions like Nurse Fredericks showed you." But the labor progressed slowly, agonizingly slowly. Mrs. Kellerman had a narrow pelvis, common in first-time mothers, especially smaller women, and despite the intensity of her contractions, dilation advanced at a crawl. Hours passed. Noon came and went. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Mrs. Kellerman was exhausted, weeping, begging for it to be over. "Please," she sobbed. "Please make it stop. I can't do this anymore. I can't." "You can," Vivian kept saying, wiping the woman's forehead with a cool cloth. Quote 76 At 2:45 p.m., Dr. Ashford made a decision. Quote 77 He injected the synthetic hormone, and within 20 minutes contractions became even more powerful. Mrs. Kellerman screamed with each one, her face bright red, sweat pouring down her temples. Vivian held one hand, Mrs. Fredericks held the other, and they both kept up a constant stream of encouragement. Quote 78 Finally, mercifully, at 3:42 p.m., nearly 6 hours after labor began in earnest, the baby crowned. Dr. Ashford guided the infant out with practiced skill, and for a terrible, eternal moment, the baby was blue and silent. Dorothy Kellerman's scream cut through the room. "Is he breathing? Is my baby breathing?" Then Dr. Ashford suctioned the airway and the infant gasped, coughed, and let out a loud, indignant wail. The most beautiful sound in the world. "He's perfect," Dr. Ashford said with satisfaction. "Absolutely perfect. Congratulations, Mrs. Kellerman. You have a healthy baby boy." Dorothy Kellerman burst into sobs of relief and joy. "Can I hold him? Please, can I hold him?" "In just a moment. Nurse Halstead needs to clean him up first." Vivian received the infant from Dr. Ashford, cradling the slippery, bloody, screaming newborn with expert gentleness. She carried him to the warming table in the corner of the delivery room and began the routine procedures, clearing mucus from nose and mouth, wiping away blood and vernix, checking his color and muscle tone and reflexes. His skin pinked up beautifully as his lungs filled with oxygen. His limbs were strong and well-formed, moving vigorously. His cry was robust, demanding. Perfect. She weighed him, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Excellent weight for a first baby. Measured him, 20 inches long. Performed the APGAR assessment. 7 out of 10 at 1 minute. He'd lost points for initial cyanosis. 9 out of 10 at 5 minutes. Completely, wonderfully healthy. She was wrapping him in a clean blanket when Mrs. Meriweather appeared at the doorway. __quote _84__. It was standard protocol. The ward attendant normally handled umbilical cord care while the nurse attended to the mother's immediate postpartum needs. But Vivian watched as Mrs. Meriweather approached, watched her look down at the baby boy, really look at him, her slightly protuberant eyes assessing his weight, his color, his vigor, and then, incredibly, she handed the baby back to Vivian. "Strong one," Mrs. Meriweather said shortly, almost dismissively. "You can manage on your own, can't you, dear? I should go check on Mrs. Bannister. Her contractions have been picking up." And she left the delivery room without another word, without touching the baby, without performing the cord care she'd ostensibly come to do. Vivian stood there, holding the healthy infant, and felt ice water run down her spine. This was the pattern. This was the terrible, damning pattern she'd been documenting for months. Mrs. Meriweather always wanted to handle the newborns first. Always. It was practically her signature behavior. Other nurses joked about it, how Constance couldn't keep her hands off the babies, how she had a, quote, 87 with them. She was always first to volunteer for cord care, for the initial bath, for settling fussy newborns. But she just walked away from this one after barely glancing at him, because he was strong. Because he didn't meet her criteria. Because he wasn't one of the ones she deemed. Vivian completed the cord care herself, hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind raced. She cleaned and weighed and measured the baby boy, filled out the required paperwork. Baby boy Kellerman, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, born 3:42 p.m., APGAR 7 out of 9, no complications. And finally carried him to his mother. Dorothy Kellerman took her son in trembling arms and stared down at him with an expression of such overwhelming love and wonder that Vivian felt tears prick her eyes. Dorothy whispered, "This baby was safe." Mrs. Meriweather had rejected him as unworthy of her, quote, 92. But what about the other one? The, quote, 93 one? Louise Bannister's contractions intensified throughout the afternoon, but she remained calm and focused, breathing through each one with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 3 times before. At 5:30 p.m., Mrs. Fredericks checked her dilation. 8 centimeters. Almost ready. Quote, 94. Quote, Mrs. Fredericks said. Quote, 95. Quote. Vivian's shift technically ended at 6 p.m., but she volunteered to stay late without hesitation. "I want to see both today's deliveries through to completion," she told Mrs. Fredericks. It wasn't unusual. Nurses often stayed past their official hours during deliveries. But the real reason was that she needed to be there when the Bannister baby was born. She needed to watch Mrs. Meriweather. At 7:15 p.m., Louise was fully dilated and ready to push. Mrs. Fredericks called Dr. Ashford, who arrived within minutes, still chewing a piece of dinner roll. At 7:28 p.m., with 3 hard pushes, the baby emerged. A girl. Tiny, delicate, perfectly formed. And not breathing. Vivian's heart rate spiked into panic territory, but her hands stayed steady. She'd been trained for this, had done it dozens of times. She received the infant from Dr. Ashford and carried her quickly to the warming table, cleared the airway, stimulated the baby, waited for that crucial first breath. Nothing. Vivian whispered, suctioning again more thoroughly. The baby's color was dusky gray-blue. Her tiny chest wasn't moving. Dr. Ashford appeared at Vivian's shoulder. How long? 30 seconds since delivery. No respiratory effort. He took over, his long fingers surprisingly gentle as he provided manual stimulation, rubbing the infant's back, flicking the soles of her feet. Quote 101. 45 seconds. 50 seconds. This was taking too long. Brain damage from oxygen deprivation could begin within minutes. Then, finally, a gasp. Weak, shuddering. The baby's chest expanded slightly. Another gasp, a tiny mewling cry. There we go, Dr. Ashford said with relief. There's our fighter. But the relief was premature. The baby's breathing was shallow, rapid, labored. She drew each breath with visible effort, her tiny ribcage contracting inward with each inhalation, a sign of respiratory distress. Her color improved slightly from gray-blue to pale pink, but her lips and fingernails remained dusky. Vivian performed the rapid assessment. Heart rate, present but rapid, over 160 beats per minute. Muscle tone, weak, limited movement. Reflex irritability, minimal response to stimulation. Color, cyanotic at extremities. Respiratory effort, poor, shallow, irregular. She weighed the baby, 5 pounds, 3 ounces, significantly underweight. APGAR score, 5 at 1 minute. Borderline, concerning. Dr. Ashford said quietly. She was connecting the infant to the oxygen apparatus, a small rubber tube providing supplemental airflow, when the door opened and Mrs. Meriweather entered. The ward attendant hadn't been called, hadn't been summoned. But she was there anyway, as if she'd sensed it, as if she always knew when one of the weak ones arrived. How is she? Mrs. Meriweather asked softly, moving closer to look at the infant. Premature, Vivian said, her voice carefully level. Respiratory distress, but breathing independently with supplemental oxygen. Poor little thing. Mrs. Meriweather's face was suffused with that gentle, pitying expression Vivian had come to dread. Vivian corrected. Mrs. Meriweather reached out as if to touch the baby, then seemed to think better of it. It was a completely reasonable request. Standard protocol. The ward attendant handled routine newborn care while the nurse attended to postpartum needs. But every instinct Vivian possessed screamed, "Don't let her near this baby." "I'll handle it myself, Mrs. Meriweather," she said. The words came out more sharply than she'd intended. __, quote _ 117 __. Mrs. Meriweather's moist eyes studied Vivian for a long moment. There was something in her gaze, surprise, suspicion, understanding, but then it dissolved into her usual soft smile. Of course, dear, whatever you think best. She left, closing the door quietly behind her. Dr. Ashford glanced at Vivian. Everything all right, Nurse Halstead? Yes, doctor. I just want to make sure everything's done correctly for such a fragile infant. Good thinking. He returned his attention to Louise Bannister, delivering the placenta, checking for tears that might need stitching. Vivian worked quickly and efficiently, performing the cord care, cleaning the baby gently with warm water, placing her in a warming crib with the oxygen continuing to flow. The tiny girl's breathing remained labored but steady. Her heart rate was still elevated, but not dangerously so. Her color was poor, but not critical. She was viable. Fragile, certainly. At risk, absolutely. But viable. If given proper care and monitoring, she had a chance. If no one interfered with that care. Louise Bannister asked weakly from the delivery bed. Dr. Ashford said gently. Vivian wheeled the warming crib to the bedside. Louise looked down at her tiny fourth daughter with an expression of worried tenderness. Louise whispered. Vivian said firmly. Louise's voice caught. Will she be all right? Neither Vivian nor Dr. Ashford could promise that, but Vivian said, "We're going to do everything we can for her. Everything." After the delivery was complete and Louise had been moved to a recovery bed in the main ward, after the warming crib with baby girl Bannister had been placed in the nursery under close observation, after Dr. Ashford had left and Mrs. Fredericks had gone to supper, Vivian sat in the staff room and pretended to complete paperwork. It was now 8:45 p.m. Her shift had ended nearly 3 hours ago. She should go home, get sleep, come back fresh tomorrow, but she couldn't leave. Not tonight. Not with that fragile baby lying in the nursery. Mrs. Meriweather was still there too. Night shift ward attendants were scarce because of the war. Young women were taking higher-paying factory jobs instead, so senior day staff often worked overtime. Perfectly normal. Perfectly innocent. Except, at 9:30 p.m., Mrs. Fredericks returned from supper and told Vivian to go home. Vivian couldn't disobey a direct order from the senior nurse without raising suspicions. She gathered her things, said goodnight, walked to the staff exit, and then circled around to the service stairwell at the back of the building and quietly climbed back up to the second floor. She found an empty supply closet with a view through the half-open door toward the nursery entrance. And she waited. At 10:15 p.m., Mrs. Fredericks made rounds through the ward, checking on the mothers, and then retired to the small office behind the nurse's station to work on paperwork. From her position in the supply closet, Vivian couldn't see into the nursery itself, but she could see the door. At 11:47 p.m., that door opened and Mrs. Meriweather entered the nursery. Vivian's heart began to pound so hard she could feel it in her throat. She waited 30 seconds. 60. 90. Then she emerged from the supply closet and moved silently down the corridor toward the nursery. The door was closed now. She pressed her ear against it. Silence. Then, soft murmuring. The sound of Mrs. Meriweather's voice, low and gentle. Praying. Vivian's hand closed on the doorknob. She turned it slowly, soundlessly, and pushed the door open just a crack. Mrs. Meriweather stood over the warming crib holding baby girl Bannister. In her right hand she held a small brown bottle. With her left hand she was unscrewing the cap. She leaned over the infant, still whispering prayer. __quote, _135 __. She extracted a glass dropper from the bottle and filled it with dark liquid, brought it toward the baby's lips. Vivian exploded through the door. "Stop!" Mrs. Meriweather jerked violently, startled. The bottle flew from her hand, hit the edge of the warming crib, and shattered on the floor. Dark liquid splashed across the white linoleum. The sharp medicinal smell of laudanum filled the air. "Vivian!" Mrs. Meriweather gasped, one hand pressed to her chest. "Dear God, you frightened me." "What were you doing?" Vivian's voice came out harsh, loud, shaking with adrenaline. __quote _140 __. Mrs. Meriweather looked down at the shattered bottle, at the spreading puddle of laudanum, at her own hand still holding the dropper. Her face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, calculation, and finally settled into something like weary resignation. Quote, 141, quote, she said quietly. Quote, 142, quote. Vivian was shaking, her whole body vibrating with horror and fury and vindication. Mrs. Meriweather's voice was very soft, very certain. "Can't you see? Look at her. Every breath is a struggle. Her lungs are too weak. She won't survive. I've seen hundreds of premature babies over 20 years, Vivian. I know the signs. This one won't make it past tomorrow." But she could linger, gasping and crying, in such terrible distress. Why? Why should she suffer like that when I can ease her passage? A few drops and she'll just slip away, peacefully. No pain, no fear, just sleep. That's murder. No. Mrs. Meriweather shook her head firmly. No, dear. Murder is cruel, selfish. This is mercy. This is love. These weak ones, these premature babies who aren't strong enough for this world. God didn't make them viable for a reason. But modern medicine forces them to struggle, to suffer, when their little bodies are telling us they're not meant to survive. I'm just helping them. Helping God's will along. Sparing them unnecessary agony. Vivian stared at the older woman, and in that moment she understood. Mrs. Meriweather wasn't lying. She wasn't making excuses. She genuinely, absolutely believed every word she was saying. She saw herself as a compassionate angel of mercy, not a murderer. She'd convinced herself that killing premature and fragile infants was an act of love, which made her even more dangerous. __quote _149 __. Vivian's voice came out as a whisper. How many babies have you done this to? Mrs. Meriweather looked at her with those moist, slightly protuberant eyes. I don't keep count, dear. That would be crass. Each one was an individual situation, an individual decision made through prayer and careful observation. Guess. The older woman was silent for a long moment. Then, perhaps 30, perhaps 40, over 20 years. Only the ones who truly needed it. Only the ones who were suffering with no hope. 30, 40, maybe more. Vivian's vision grayed at the edges. She thought she might vomit. Quote, 154, quote, she managed to say. Quote, 155, quote. Mrs. Meriweather reached out, but Vivian jerked away. Mrs. Meriweather's voice was very calm now, very reasonable. You're making an extraordinary accusation against a woman who's worked here 20 years with a spotless record, a woman everyone loves and trusts. And your evidence is what? A broken bottle of laudanum that I could say I was taking to the pharmacy for disposal. Your word against mine? She was right. The realization hit Vivian like cold water. There was no proof the laudanum had been intended for the baby. No proof Mrs. Meriweather had actually administered it to any infant. Just Vivian's testimony about what she'd witnessed, and Mrs. Meriweather's counter-testimony that it was a misunderstanding. Who would they believe? The veteran ward attendant beloved by everyone, or the young nurse with only 3 years' experience making wild accusations? But then Vivian remembered the notebook, the statistical evidence, 34 excess deaths. I have records, she said, mortality data showing a pattern. 34 deaths in 15 years, all during your shifts, all premature or fragile infants. For the first time, something like uncertainty flickered across Mrs. Meriweather's face. Quote, 162. Quote, 163. Quote, 164. Quote. Mrs. Meriweather said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. Underscore, underscore. Quote, underscore, 165 underscore, underscore. It was the same argument Vivian had used against herself for months, the same doubt that had kept her silent. But she was done with silence. Quote, 166. Quote, she repeated. Quote, 167. Quote. She turned toward the door, and Mrs. Meriweather's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, not gently, hard, the grip of someone who'd spent 20 years lifting and carrying infants, someone much stronger than her soft grandmother appearance suggested. Mrs. Meriweather said, and for the first time there was real desperation in her voice. Mrs. Meriweather released her wrist immediately, stepping back, hands raised in a placating gesture. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 173, underscore, underscore. Vivian was already moving, walking quickly toward the staff room, toward the telephone mounted on the wall. Her hands shook so badly she could barely lift the receiver. She dialed 0 for the hospital operator. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 174, underscore, 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 she said, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. She hung up, turned around. Mrs. Meriweather stood in the doorway of the nursery, one hand on the doorframe as if needing support. Her face was very pale. Her eyes were wet, but then they were always wet. Quote, the older woman said quietly, quote, Vivian said, quote, Mrs. Meriweather was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly, turned, and walked back into the nursery. Vivian watched through the open door as the older woman approached the warming crib holding baby girl Bannister. For one terrible moment, Vivian thought Mrs. Meriweather might try to harm the baby anyway, might try to smother her, But the ward attendant just stood there, looking down at the tiny, struggling infant, one hand reaching out to gently touch the baby's head. I'm sorry, Mrs. Meriweather whispered. To the baby? To God? To Vivian? I'm so sorry. I thought I was helping. I truly did. And she stood there, unmoving, until the police arrived 15 minutes later. The police came first. 2 patrolmen, young men who looked barely old enough to shave, clearly uncertain how to handle a situation involving baby murder accusations in a hospital. Then Dr. Raymond Pritchard arrived, disheveled and furious at being woken at midnight. Then Dr. Ashford. Then the night supervisor. Soon the small staff room was crowded with people, everyone talking over each other, trying to understand what was happening. Everyone be quiet, Dr. Pritchard finally roared. He was a large man, 63 years old, with iron-gray hair and a voice accustomed to command. The room fell silent. He turned to Vivian. Nurse Halstead, you called this meeting. Explain. Vivian's mouth was dry, but she forced the words out. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 186, underscore, underscore, underscore. The room erupted again. Dr. Pritchard held up one hand for silence and turned to Mrs. Meriweather, who stood quietly near the window, hands folded, face serene. Her voice was calm. Vivian said, her voice rising. Mrs. Meriweather corrected gently. Dr. Pritchard's face had gone gray. How many, Constance? How many babies are we talking about? I don't know exactly. I never kept count. Each one was an individual decision made through prayer. But over 20 years, perhaps 35, perhaps 40. The number hung in the air like poison. One of the young patrolmen found his voice. Ma'am, I'm going to have to take you in for questioning. Not yet, Dr. Pritchard interrupted. He looked at Vivian. What evidence do you have besides your own testimony? Vivian hesitated. The notebook was back at the nurse's residence, hidden in her room. But she had the data memorized. Quote, 199, quote, 200, quote. Mrs. Meriweather said, echoing her earlier argument. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore. 201, underscore, underscore. Dr. Ashford spoke up. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore. 202, underscore, 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 underscore. Quote, underscore. 203, underscore, underscore. Vivian said. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore. 204, underscore, underscore. They all moved to the nursery. The shattered brown bottle lay in a puddle of dark liquid. One of the patrolmen carefully collected fragments of glass in a handkerchief, sniffed them. Mrs. Meriweather explained calmly. It was plausible, frighteningly plausible. Dr. Pritchard turned to the patrolman. Quote, 208, quote. He stopped, his face going even grayer. Quote, 209, quote. Mrs. Meriweather flinched at that, the first real crack in her composure. Dr. Pritchard continued, she asked quietly. The patrolman exchanged uncertain glances. Mrs. Meriweather nodded. She walked to the staff room, collected her coat and handbag, and left without another word. The sound of her footsteps fading down the corridor was the loneliest sound Vivian had ever heard. After she left, Dr. Pritchard slumped into a chair and put his head in his hands. Quote, 214, quote, he said. Quote, 215, quote. Quote, 216, quote, Dr. Ashford said quietly. Dr. Pritchard said sharply, but he didn't sound convinced. He turned to Vivian, and his expression was hard to read. Nurse Halstead, I hope to God you're right about this, because if you're wrong, you've just destroyed an innocent woman's life and career, and your own. Vivian met his eyes steadily. I'm not wrong, sir. We'll see. The investigation began that night and would eventually consume 3 weeks. Dr. Pritchard called in the county medical examiner's office. They reviewed every infant death at Allegheny Maternity Hospital from 1928 to 1943, hundreds of records. They identified the 34 cases Vivian had flagged, plus 16 more suspicious cases that fit similar patterns. They contacted families and requested permission for exhumation and toxicology testing on the most recent deaths, the ones where drug traces might still be detectable. 6 families agreed. 6 tiny coffins were dug up from cemeteries across Pittsburgh. Toxicology found traces of opiates in 4 of the 6 bodies. Not conclusive proof by itself, opiates were sometimes used in end-of-life care for dying infants, but highly suspicious given the circumstances. They interviewed every nurse, doctor, and staff member who'd worked with Mrs. Meriweather over the past 20 years. Most were shocked, defensive, disbelieving. She's a saint, they kept saying. She would never hurt a baby. But a few, just a few, admitted to having had suspicions they'd never voiced. A funny smell sometimes on babies who'd been in Mrs. Meriweather's care. The way she seemed almost too eager to volunteer for the __quote _224 cases. The strange pattern of deaths. __quote _225 retired nurse confessed. __quote _226 . And then, investigators searched Mrs. Meriweather's room at the boarding house on Highland Avenue and found the journals. 5 leather-bound journals, hidden in a locked trunk under her bed. Dated from 1924 to 1943. And inside, in Mrs. Meriweather's careful handwriting. March 15, 1928. Baby boy Chen. 4 pounds, 8 ounces. Lungs too weak, struggling terribly. Gave 3 drops laudanum. Passed peacefully within the hour. Lord have mercy on his soul. November 22, 1930. Baby girl Morrison. 5 pounds even. Heart defect. Would not have survived. Gave 4 drops paregoric. Went quietly. Thank you, God, for allowing me to spare her suffering. Entry after entry after entry. 38 in total. 4 more than even Vivian had identified. Each one meticulously documented. Baby's name, weight, condition, number of drops administered, time of death. And always, always, a prayer or religious justification. The journals were the smoking gun. Undeniable proof. The police arrested Mrs. Constance Meriweather on May 1, 1943, and charged her with 38 counts of murder in the 2nd degree.